If any of you ever hear my wife Kirsten talk about the process of childbirth, you're going to hear quite a story. Words like profound, intimate, and formational come out. Her experience and her memory of them are ones of endurance and striving and work and single-minded determination to get through to experience the amazing joy at the end of this process, something that she describes as forming her identity at the most basic of levels. Now, these are only some of the words that I would use to describe this same experience. You see, while Kirsten was the one doing all of the work, doing what she was supposed to be doing, and I was surrounded by all of these medical professionals who are highly trained in doing their work, I was on the outside, just trying to interpret and understand everything that was going on around me. I had questions. Is it supposed to take this long? Was she supposed to be making those noises? Where was the energy for all of this work coming from, since every meal that I'd ever seen her eat in the last week had departed from her body at the beginning of the labor process? When she nearly bit my finger off, was she simply trying to say, "I love you," in a deeply mystical, endorphin-fueled way? I didn't know. All I had seen of the childbirth process was in the movies. And in the movies, all it shows is pain and breathing and pushing and dire promises of lifelong celibacy from this point forward. So why in the world would anybody do this more than once? Although I must say, as a second child, thank you, Mom, for doing it more than once. And this doesn't end with childbirth either. Did you know that the average cost of raising a child in Canada to the age of 18 is $250,000? And the average night's sleep for new parents, 4 hours and 44 minutes. Now that is a long way short of the recommended 8 hours a night in order to safely operate a motor vehicle. And yet here we are. So the question for me isn't necessarily why would anyone do this more than once, but why would anybody do this at all? And so it is with the church. Friends, I think that a lot of people who drive by churches or who would walk up to the front door of a church have a lot of these same questions. Imagine with me the first time that you put your hand on the door of a new church. For some of you, this might have been so long ago that you don't remember because you were carried across the threshold of your first new church when you were unable to walk yet because you weren't old enough. For others of you, this might be a point in your future and you haven't done it yet. And if that's you, then a special welcome to you. We're so glad that you're here with us. But when you put your hand on the door of a church and it's full of people inside, questions come up in our minds. All of the what if questions come up. What if I'm not dressed right? What if people look at me strange because I'm not dressed right? What if I don't say the right things? What if I'm not perfect yet? Worse yet, what if people find out that I'm not perfect? What if I sit or stand or say something at the wrong times? What if no one talks to me? What if I've been hurt previously by a Christian or by the church? Why would I do this? Why would I open this door and walk in? Now, I think that the passage that we're reading today deals with some of the same question. I also acknowledge that the story that we're covering today has a lot of family themes in it, as Paul talks about and to the church in Thessalonica. See, Paul compares himself to an infant and a nursing mother and a patient father. He says that he's been attacked and beaten and imprisoned and strongly encouraged to leave the city of Philippi in his previous experience. So then why in the world would Paul go down the street and do the exact same thing again? On these weekends where we celebrate Mother's Day and on another weekend Father's Day or other holidays, these can be hard times for people. For many of us, All that we've experienced in life are the hard things, the bad side of what Paul mentions. We've seen selfishness or authority that is misused or abused, maybe a lack of honesty or integrity, or the encouragement and nurturing care that we need. Maybe we've experienced loss and we long for these things. How can we expect positive, warm, fuzzy feelings about a church from a passage that is so heavily invested in family language? Remember the audience that Paul is talking to. This isn't a 20th century Canadian setting. For many of Paul's audience, listening to him and deciding to follow Jesus would mean that they would be abandoned by their families. They would be cut off from their relatives and their community and the people that they depend on. Friends, this is still true in parts of our world today. I remember sitting across from a young mother who had fled her home country one step ahead of her husband, who was trying to have her executed simply because she decided to follow Jesus. This is a reality in our broken world. Paul says that the true church functions as a redeeming community for our broken human systems and categories. We experience love and nurture and care from church moms and dads. We're encouraged and admonished by church grandmas and grandpas. I'm only alive today because when I left my home and my family in Olds and moved to Lethbridge, I was taken in and given shelter and cared for and often fed, just loved by my Lethbridge mom and dad, Shane and Diane Porter. My children know that when they come to church, they know whose pockets have candy in them after the church services. And when I can't be in the physical presence of my family, it's the church that fills my needs for that care. So how do we do this? How do we go about building such trust and such generosity among perfect strangers? What is the secret of the church? Well, Paul tells us several things in this short passage. He starts off by telling us that to do this, to try to build this kind of community, is fraught with risk. So remember, he's just been imprisoned and beaten and chased off. It's very difficult to have the courage to try again if you've been burnt in the past. But remember also that the definition of courage is not a lack of fear, but it's having the ability to master your fear, to respond with wisdom, to know what risks are worth taking and what risks point to something that should be avoided. Second, Paul tells us several things to avoid. See, in Paul's time, there would be traveling philosophers who would go from town to town and city to city, and they would teach. They would have benefactors or patrons who liked their teaching and would pay them to spread their word. So for unscrupulous philosophers, it was possible to gain wealth if you were willing to sacrifice the truth a little bit. Now, maybe not completely, but subtly. A little misdirection here, a little flattery over there, and then watch the patronage dollars just roll in. Truth for sale just feels gross. We all know it, and we've all seen it when it happens. I think of the pastor on television who was calling for his audience to sow their finances into the kingdom of his ministry just before he climbed onto his private jet to go to a retreat in a home in the tropics far away. I Googled it. Did you know that there are at least 10 pastors in North America who have one or more private jets? One pastor that I read about, he said that the reason that he needed a private jet was so that he could do his preparation, because on commercial flights, too many people were recognizing him, and they were bothering him, asking him to pray for them and with them. Can you imagine how that affects the reputation of that pastor? And not even that, how it reflects on the church as a whole and how that affects the reputation of the God that we work for, that we represent, that loves us. It makes trust impossible to build. So Paul emphasizes a lifestyle that is in contrast to these kinds of people in 1 Thessalonians. And I want to read again 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning in verse 3, for that contrast. He says, "For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts. You know we never use flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or from anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you." Paul went out of his way to protect the integrity of the gospel. Instead of taking liberties with the truth to make his life easier, he was very careful about how he spoke about God, with integrity, with honesty, and forthrightness. Rather than seeking to convert people for profit, he was very careful and transparent about his finances. He didn't link his own livelihood to the conversion of his audience. And rather than using his platform as a public speaker to gain a reputation and fame for himself, he acted like a little child, being dependent on the goodness of his audience. In fact, he didn't even use his resume as an apostle or as a Pharisee of Pharisees, or his pedigree of having come from a long line of Jewish leaders and scholars in order to command obedience or an audience or listening. He simply went and lived and worked with the Thessalonians. That's quite a shift. Where many traveling philosophers would go and teach in a place until the money dried up and then they'd move on to richer fields, Paul puts down roots. He lives his message, giving not only his teaching, but his life to the Thessalonians. And this is what puts Paul over the top. Even today, there are a lot of businesses that take care of people professionally. We have therapists and doctors and teachers and counselors and nurses, police, all kinds of professionals who are intimately involved in our lives every day. And yet they appropriately work to maintain professional distance. Just doesn't work that way with Paul. He says that they were glad to share their lives with the people. And this is interesting to me. I was in a conversation with a few pastors a couple of years ago during one of my classes. We were supposed to be discussing what should be the priority: the teaching of the theological truth of the gospel in order to convert people, or the care of their other needs, their physical, economic, and social needs. What should a Christian prioritize? The debate was robust, and there were a lot of different opinions and proof and all kinds of ideas coming out. But I can't help but think that Paul and Jesus with him together might have just rolled their eyes at us. Because in verse 8, this is what Paul says: "Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well." Friends, there's no distinction in Paul's life between the gospel that he was teaching and what he was living. The church is not a professional place. It's an intensely personal one. The metaphors that Paul uses here, that of a nursing mother and an involved father, they're not professional roles. See, in ancient Thessalonica, they didn't have options for how to feed and nurture a newborn child. Instead, a nursing mother would feed the baby from the very nutrients of her own body. She gives it everything that it could possibly need. Without her, human life on earth would end within one generation. And in Paul's culture, what does a good father do? Well, he's present in the life of a child. He's correcting and encouraging and picking them up when they fail. Now, I know that these are outdated gender roles in our culture, but we have to understand that Paul is using what he sees around him, what his audience see around them, to help them understand how he feels about the church. For Paul, parents are safety nets for the children. They don't just take care of their financial and physical needs. They give of themselves. They love. One of the most famous chapters in Scripture is called the love chapter, and it's found in 1 Corinthians 13. I'd like to pick it up a half verse earlier than that in 1 Corinthians 12:31. And yet I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I might boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is intense and costly and personal and vulnerable. And friends, love is vital in the church if we are going to fulfill the role that God has given us of building the people of God here. So why is it worth it? I get now why people have more than one child. I mean, other than the reason that my son gives, which is so that all the chores will get done because that lawn isn't going to mow itself. People have children because of love. But why the church? Why is Paul risking another beating or another stretch in prison or another brush with death for the church? Well, it's for God's glory. Now, glory is a word that I've been using for a long time, but I'm not sure that I really understood it until I listened to a sermon by Mark Clark, who's the pastor of Village Church in British Columbia. Mark's idea was that God's glory is the weighty thickness of God's presence. It's like his mass or his gravitas. One writer likens it to a boulder falling off of a cliff and into a stream. If the glory of the boulder is greater than that of the water, then the water is pushed out and the boulder remains. Now, this to me is a picture of what the church is on about. People from all walks of life, from all backgrounds and family experiences come to the church, and they wonder, what will their experience of God be? They've been fed a steady diet of gossip and tricksters, pyramid schemes, and exploitation. Maybe their family was traumatic. Maybe their jobs are reducing them to just a number. Maybe they've been betrayed by a friend. Slowly, they've come to believe that this is who they are, a number in a long list of numbers, good only to be used or abused, alone and lonely. But in the church, they encounter people like you, people who show them Paul's better way, who not only share good, truthful teaching, but your very lives with them, eating and sleeping and working and playing. The sheer glory of the people of God pushing out all of the lies that people have been fed until they understand the truth of their identity before God in creation. They are loved, and not just loved by people, but by God. Is that you? Maybe you don't know how it is that you've come to be watching this YouTube video, or you have no idea why you keep tuning in week after week. Disappointment might be too mild of a word to describe your experience with the church. Maybe you've been hurt more by the followers of Jesus than you've been helped. And if that's your experience, then all I can say is to ask for your forgiveness, because that was not right. I would pray for you that you would find this kind of true and redeeming expression of God's people, God's family, and that it would draw you in to the love of the eternal God. Bruce spoke a couple of years ago about a picture in his mind that he had of First Baptist Church people being like hundreds of little lights all around the city. Today, under the global threat of sickness, we are those lights. And it's not just in Lethbridge, but it's happening in Nova Scotia and in British Columbia and in Arizona and in many places in between. It's amazing. All of these little boulders displacing the lies and the darkness around you, bringing the glory of the living God into your home and into your neighborhood and into your world. Is this true of you? Is this true of us? What stops us from being vulnerable like a child, from loving and giving ourselves away like a nursing mother, from encouraging, comforting, and urging righteousness like a good father? I pray that the glory of God would first heal and transform us and push these things that block us out of the way, and then would use us to do the same thing for others. In the name of Jesus and for the glory of God. Amen.